Mr. President, I rise today to speak about the priorities facing Montana and this nation. Creating jobs, responsibly cutting our spending, cutting the deficit, rebuilding our economy. I appreciate the proposal that will be put forth, I think, later this evening to attempt to create jobs. And when that proposal gets to the floor, I will vote to have the debate on S-1723, because only then will I be able to offer my amendments to that bill, because as it is written, I cannot support that bill. Having the debate will allow us an opportunity to amend it so that it will guarantee jobs in Montana and across America. Mr. President, the perspective that I bring to the table is a little different than most. I'm someone who lives in, works in, represents a rural state. My responsibility is to make sure that every decision that I make works for not only Montana, but the entire country. I expect full accountability for every penny of taxpayer dollars that we spend. I expect that when you invest in something, you get what you pay for. A lot of folks know that I'm a farmer, but many don't know that I'm also a former school teacher. I used to teach elementary music at Big Sandy Elementary in Big Sandy, Montana. I fully understand the importance of making sure all of our nation's teachers have the resources that they need to do their job, to lead our most important resource, our children. As a teacher, I also know that when rural schools are asked to compete with urban schools for federal funding, rural schools often get left behind. The same goes for emergency responders. Their service, sometimes even as volunteers, and it's very important to rural states like Montana, whether it's firefighters, police officers, EMTs, they're on the clock whenever they are needed. In Montana, as everywhere else, firefighters are respected for their courage, for their hard work, for doing whatever is expected of them to save property and save lives. But when Montana's rural fire departments and rural police departments have to compete for federal funding, guess who often gets the short end of the stick? That's right, it's the emergency responders in rural states like Montana. The folks who often don't have the professional grant writers to help them secure the basic equipment that they need to do their jobs safely. And that brings me to my proposal. I want to state again, as 1723 is written, I cannot support it. I'm not convinced it will create the jobs that it must create. $30 billion in this bill is meant to go to states to boost education, to hire teachers. Yes, investing in education is a powerful short-term and long-term way to create jobs. But as written, this bill fails to give taxpayers any guarantee that this money would actually be used to hire teachers and invest in our schools. The fact is, this money could be used to supplant funds instead of supplement funds. State would get loads of money with little guidance that they spend the money on teachers. But we all know what happens. A lot of smart folks who work in state budget office that can find their ways around guidance, because money's pretty darn easy to move from one budget account to another. In other words, there's no guarantee that this bill will create the jobs. Mr. President, Montana is one of two states that has a budget surplus right now. We have been living within our means. There are other states like Kansas that are considering broad-based tax cuts, and that's fine. Kansas can do that if it wants, but I'm not convinced that we should be writing checks to states so that they can cut taxes. Montanans shouldn't be paying for tax cuts for people in other states. Nor should we be giving precious taxpayer money for states to build up their rainy day fund. I'm all for individual states making smart choices with their own money, but giving them federal money and just hoping they'll use it for education and teachers, well, that's not good enough. For that kind of money, we need a guarantee. So, Mr. President, if the motion to proceed is adopted, I plan to offer two amendments to address my concerns. One will address the $5 billion in this bill meant to provide aid to the nation's first responders. My amendment is a simple one. It requires that 20% of the competitive grant funding go specifically for rural communities. It's only fair, because rural communities make up 20% of our nation. The other amendment puts sideboards on the remainder of the money in this bill to guarantee that it was to be used in a way that it's supposed to be used, to create jobs and education, to invest in our kids. My amendment will prohibit states from pulling their own state money out of education programs when they take this federal money. How? By putting the money into Part B of the Individual and Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, otherwise known locally as special education. When I traveled around Montana after the passage of the Recovery Act in 2009, school administrators told me that the money that made it to the ground was very much appreciated, but the special education was their top priority. IDEA funding is still one of the biggest unfunded mandates the federal government has on local school districts. When it was first enacted, the federal government promised to pay 40% of the cost of this important law. Today, we pay less than half of that promise. This amendment will help bridge that gap somewhat. Special education funding is not only a top priority for folks in Montana, it also guarantees that the funding gets to the local level.
The Senate will come to order.
It also guarantees that the funding will get to the local level. If the money in this bill is supposed to be for teachers, then let's make sure it ends up there. This amendment is a good way to go about doing just that. And I would ask unanimous consent, Mr. President, that these two amendments be inserted into the record.
Without objection.
And finally, Mr. President, I'd like to talk about one other thing missing from this bill, and that's reauthorization of the Secure Rural Schools program and the payment in lieu of taxes, otherwise known as PILT. These two programs will do more to ensure that thousands of teachers stay on the job than anything else that we can do around here. And here's the kicker. In the middle of this partisan debate, Secure Rural Schools and PILT are bipartisan programs. Under the leaderships of Senators Bingaman, Murkowski, Baucus, Crapo, Wyden, and Risch, we have a bill that could pass right now today. It would keep 4,000 teachers on the job at a cost of $3.5 billion over the next 5 years. That's small potatoes compared to the $35 billion in the bill that's before us today. It is a reasonable bill, but because it is so reasonable, no one wants to see it appear in the middle of such a partisan debate. Once again, too many folks in Washington are looking for ways to point fingers. Well, quite frankly, Mr. President, I don't have as many fingers as most of the folks around here, so I'd rather use mine to solve some problems. Mr. President, only after this final bill is amended to guarantee job certainty will it be able to earn my vote. And in order to amend it, I'm going to vote for the motion to proceed. My vote is a vote for debate that we ought to have. It's an important one so we can truly create the jobs and focus on rebuilding our economy. I look forward to that debate, Mr. President. And with that, I would yield the floor to my friend from West Virginia.